Welcome and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today to discuss A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. We are thrilled to have with us a special guest, Roya Hakakian. Roya is a poet, a journalist, and author. Her most recent work is the inspiration for today's discussion, A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. And we highly recommend you all check it out, pick up your own copy in stores now. Roya is also, I wanted to know, a founding member of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. So Roya, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted. Thank you so much. I have very fond memories of my last discussion at the World Affairs Council, and I deeply feel that I'm among friends.
You are, and we're thrilled to have you back. So thank you so much. My name is Amanda Jolly, VP of Programs with the World Affairs Council. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge the support of so many partners who made today's event possible. Firstly, a huge thank you to Connecticut Humanities for all of their support to support this event and to make this discussion possible. I also want to thank Murtha Cullina with a particular thanks to Council Board Member Dana Buchin for their additional support of today's conversation. And lastly, I want to acknowledge our partners at the Connecticut Immigrant and Refugee Coalition. I know so many of you out there are joining us today, and we're thrilled to have you here with us. We also recently learned that Roya is an honorary board member. So we're so glad we could bring everyone together to join in this discussion today. So with that, I will, let's get this started, and I'm pleased to turn it over to you, Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I want to start today by acknowledging two things. As I sit here in my office in the Asylum Hill Neighborhood Association in Hartford, I am sitting on the traditional native lands of the Wangunk, the Saucog, the Tunxus, and the Pequannock people. And I say that today to acknowledge the struggles of our native and first American nations, but also to ground all of us in this discussion that whether it was by force or by choice, that our ancestral ties and our origin stories are all tied to another place and the common thread that runs through all of that. And second, it is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I want to recognize that through the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment, into the most recent rise in Asian American hate crimes, that this group of immigrants, the fastest growing group of immigrants here in the United States, contributes so much to our nation and to our communities, that I'm very proud that we're celebrating them this month. But today I'm so excited to be talking to you, Roya. Roya, welcome to State of the World.
Thank you so much.
I'm so excited to be talking about this book, A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. It is a fantastic book. So I want to start by getting to know you a little bit more. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the United States?
How I came. Wow, that could be a whole other book on its own.
I imagine.
My mother and I left Iran in 1984, which obviously is another lifetime. And it's part of sort of the story of really our departure is part of not just the story of our family, but the story of contemporary Iran as well, because it was the Iranian Revolution in 1979 that created such an upheaval that eventually forced many Iranians out of the country, and my mother and I are among them. The current diaspora of Iranians in the world is the largest it has ever been throughout Iran's history, and we're talking about a very ancient civilization. So my mother and I were forced to leave. There was a war between Iran and Iraq in those years, and the circumstances were such that the prospects of a future looked bleaker and so it seemed that leaving was something we had to do. Besides, I was born and raised in a Jewish family, and religious minorities and ethnic minorities were under tremendous pressure in Iran at the time. And so, we were refugees in Europe for about a year until our asylum applications were approved. And then in 1985, the two of us came to the United States, and we arrived at John F. Kennedy Airport in Queens, New York. And it's really funny because I sat down to write this book, and I could not believe how readily available so many of those early memories were just completely available to me. In a way, I think, even though I was jet lagged and exhausted and completely dizzy, I think I recognized, despite all that it was an important moment. And I was observing, watching, registering every small detail to the best of my ability. And I remember that the airport, we stepped out of the airport, the front doors threw open, and I came out. I stepped out onto the street and thought that I had entered the land of giants. Everything from cars to people were taller, cars were bigger, and just the horizon was far vaster than I had ever seen or remembered. And that was my very first impression.
So at what point do you think, or did it ever happen that you sort of came to think of the US as home?
Oh, not for a very, very long time. I mean, I think this is something that somehow we all expect of immigrants. We expect them to arrive, be grateful, get a job, start learning English, and know the plan for the future, on day one. And if not by day one, then, we give them 2 weeks. And the truth is that I really feel, for me at least, and maybe, I've always been a late bloomer, I can't, I can't claim that, things happen for me quickly. But that said, I really do think that for all of us, the notion of arrival is not an instant event. The instant event that comes with arrival is simply the landing of the plane. The plane touches down and you have officially arrived. That's the only guarantee that we have about the notion of, somebody having arrived. Everything else happens in increments. And I think part of the difficulty that those who are not immigrants have with immigrants is that they expect that arrival, that physical arrival, necessarily ought to come with emotional, intellectual, and just all around psychological arrival. And the two are never paired. And it took me many, many years and many encounters with many people. And the sort of the process of undergoing, college, encountering people I began to like and admire, encountering people who understood me, understood the fact that I was bereft as an immigrant, understood the fact that I didn't want to be here, and thought that was okay. And that long and protracted process eventually brought me to this moment where I feel like I am an American. We can argue about what that means. We can argue what qualities ought to go into making up an American. But now I feel that way. But what I really want to impress upon all those who are hearing us today is that it's a very long and incremental process. And it doesn't mean that those who arrive aren't immediately grateful or happy, but it just means that they need time to thaw and to get their bearings and to master a little bit the community and the environment where they're in. in order to begin to think things through and begin to show the responses that others hope to see from them.
So Roya, why did you write this book? Why did you feel the need to write this book now?
In 2016, when Donald Trump started giving speeches about immigrants, I heard a few things that came to me as a sort of existential threat. It was very interesting because obviously I'm a naturalized citizen, but I don't know if you remember, but there was a point that there was a conversation early on that maybe some of the naturalized citizens should have their naturalizations revoked, and I began thinking, oh my God, so there were several things that I heard that really alarmed me and terrified me. One was that, well, Iran was placed under a ban. So a lot of people who are my compatriots share the circumstances that that drove me out of Iran. They were under the same circumstances and they could no longer get in because Iran was placed under a ban. So that was number one. And I began thinking, oh my God, if rather than 1985, I were to want to come to the United States in 2016, I would not have been allowed to come here. The other was that there was a conversation or a debate about not allowing immigrants who didn't speak English or didn't have skills. Well, I was 18 when I came. I spoke no English. In fact, when I started working at an office, it was a prosthetics building office, dental office, and they put me in the front office and they told me that I should take phone calls. And I remember that the calls would come through, I pick up, and someone at the other end of the line would say, "Can I speak to John?" And it's very hard for an immigrant to handle telephone calls, because at least face to face, you can do a lot more. You can read the emotions, there are a lot of cues that you can't have on the telephone. So, I would say, "Can you repeat?" And, the person on the other end would say, "Can I speak to John?" And I would say, "Can you please spell that?" And they would go John, and I couldn't keep up. So being 19 and not knowing exactly what I should do, I kept hanging up on them. And after about a week, my boss, who was a very nice guy, came and said, he came to me with a stack of those pink memo papers and said, "Look, all these people say that they have called several times and haven't been able to get through. So clearly you're not able to manage this." And I said, "True," and I left that job. But my point being that I spoke no English, I had no skills, and the country where I had come from was under a ban. And I was sitting there in 2016 thinking, 3 strikes against me. I would not have been allowed into this country if someone else had been president. And therefore I thought, somehow I have to write a book. I have to write, and initially, actually, Megan, it wasn't a book that I thought about. I started writing several articles. I ran a big essay in Reuters. I had another big piece in The Guardian. And then I felt that it was not enough, and that it wasn't a job that could be done in a simple article. So I sat down and I thought, I have to convince people somehow that immigrants are not criminals, or at least the overwhelming majority of immigrants who come to this country come here because they want to rebuild or build new lives. They bring their hopes, and their intention is to contribute and also not just to the life in America, but also to the lives of those whom they've left behind. And so I had to think through how I could do that best, because I needed to defend the reason I had been brought into this country. I needed to somehow prove to others that it was not a mistake to let me in. So that was really a major impetus. And then I thought I also had to speak on behalf of my brethren and say that, when we come here, we may do, wrong things, we may commit crimes, but the incentive, the major motivation that brings us here is to build lives both here and contribute to those elsewhere. And so I thought my job in this book was to bring readers as close to the visceral, emotional, psychological, intellectual experience of an immigrant who touches down at the airport and goes through all the small steps of resettling. And I thought, if I can do that properly, if I can bring people really close to what it's like, if not for all of us, at least for some of us, then maybe by coming close to that experience, by feeling what we feel, by hearing the thoughts that go through our heads, then maybe we become more human at a time that I thought other forces were trying to undermine our humanity. And that was really the reason why I put this together.
So the book really sort of cuts through perception versus reality for an immigrant. And here on State of the World, we have what's called the 5. So I'm going to ask you for your 5. But reflecting on the content of the book, what are the 5 best pieces of advice that you have for, say, a newly arrived immigrant as they sort of navigate that perception versus reality?
Right. One is expect to be dizzy. And I hear that from fellow immigrants too, that the dizziness is not just physical, and it's not just the side effect of jet lag. The dizziness is, just it's a cataclysm, and you feel that you have actually been hit by a truck in more ways than one. So expect to be dizzy. Expect people to ask you where you're from, but that's not an offense. America is a very large country. Everybody comes from somewhere. As Americans, we ask this question, even from, our fellow Americans who seem to have a faint accent. Try not to feel insecure if you have to respond to that question, which naturally comes to all of us. We have heard it over and over again. And the next is, expect to make mistakes, and that's okay. And also that there are people who will be your guides. I was fortunate enough to have a professor in college who somehow was kind enough to spend a great deal of time to talk me through various processes, both at school and beyond. And so it's nice to find a guide to help you in those early days, someone who can just explain things that would otherwise not make a whole lot of sense. And try to lower your own expectations. Nothing has to happen immediately the way you imagined it. You can take your time and just try to find your bearings before you go after your long-term goals.
So in the book, you describe a unifying American identity. Can you talk a little bit about the unique qualities of an American and whether or not this identity serves to welcome or exclude immigrants and refugees from under its umbrella?
Yeah, well, I think we've arrived at a particular moment in our own American history where all of us are wondering, given racial tensions and a lot of political tensions, I think that the entire country, immigrants and none, are trying to figure out what it means really to be American. And for the longest time, people who came from certain countries, or had certain racial qualities, felt that they were the ones who were the true Americans, as if there was such a thing as being a true American that was especially associated with, racial qualities or physical qualities. I think we've arrived at a moment when we realize that that assessment has failed. And we need to arrive at a new definition for what can unify us as a nation. And I think actually that the ingredients for that all exist in the founding ideals of this country. Many things were imperfect when they took place early on, but there are some nuggets of excellent advice that from George Washington's writings and speeches down onward, we can extract. And I think the common shared belief in certain fundamental ideas, we all are entitled to pursue our own ways to be happy. We are all individuals who ought to be equal before the law. We all, no matter what religion, race, or creed we come from, we all are equal citizens in this country, regardless of gender and other qualities that are inborn to us. So I think the commitment the commitment that we need to demand, whether it's from immigrants or non-immigrants, is a commitment to these shared values. And the farther away we get from whatever the notion was, that it is a certain physical quality, a certain racial quality that makes us American, and the closer we get to the notion that these fundamental values, the commitment to these fundamental values, is what really binds us, the more unified and seamless we will become as a nation.
So in your book, you talk about the contribution of refugees and asylees. In fact, you use the figure that from 2005 to 2014, refugees and asylees contributed more than $63 billion to the US economy than were given in social services. What is it going to take for us to sort of recognize that contribution? How can we, as a community, as a society, sort of look to rectifying and to understanding just how big that contribution is?
Well, I think part of what I'm trying to do is in this book is to give voice to at least some of us. No single book can claim to represent or be the voice of everyone, but at least some of us. And my effort was at trying to make sure that it's an unmediated voice, because when it comes to immigrants, for reasons of lack of language or access, we're almost always mediated, whether it's by policymakers, politicians, or journalists or lawyers. There are always other people who are speaking on our behalf. And I think one of the things that can be really important at this particular moment is to try to create a pool of unmediated voices, that somehow we need to create a way where, given all the shortcomings that may come with it, immigrants can speak directly to the rest of us. And I think this actually is a very crucial year to come to that sense of appreciation. Because of COVID, none of us would have had fresh fruits and vegetables were it not been for the migrant workers on the southern border in California and in Texas and in those bordering states. We ate because they worked. And if there was any other time where things were normal and we couldn't see their contribution, this year should make it clear that the people who truly sustained us and supplied us with edible food were them. And that, you know, aside from the fact that they have, you know, from really from farmers to, I don't know, Silicon Valley engineers, we have used and needed them all. And if and that we cannot be the nation that we've been. We can't be at the edge of innovation if we fail to bring in this mix of nationalities that we have always had and allowed in, because that's what stirs creativity, that's what's bringing about debate, conversation, and pushes the rest of us forward to achieve.
So for using that, I'm going to bring in an audience question. Do you think now is the time, or what is it going to take for this country to sort of develop a fair and equitable immigration policy?
Well, I am hoping that under the current administration, we can do so much better than we did under the previous administration. However, that said, I think you know, we need to bring in refugees. We need to allow in a vast array of immigrants into this country, not because we want to be good to them, which we do, I hope, but also because we need to keep being who we are. And being who we are is bound with this ability to bring in others and create a mix here within our own population. But that said, I think what many of us often forget is that, you know, due to this climate crisis and the crisis on the American, you know, various political crises on the American continent, the rate of immigration is going to skyrocket if it hasn't already. And so some of the remedies that we need to be thinking about as far as addressing the needs of immigrants is concerned isn't simply a matter of raising the quotas and allowing more immigrants into this country. It also requires that we enter into regional relationships, continental relationships with other governments and countries in order to create a more sustainable life for the people who plan to move right there where they are. Because according to The Economist, you know, 1/3 of the entire population in the world is either on the move or is planning to move. And no single country can possibly address this, this crisis unless we all do two things at the same time. We accept our immigrants, we bring them in, but also we address the factors and the forces that are driving them out, so that they can be where they are and their lives are more livable.
What is the biggest takeaway you want people to have from this book, both from the immigrant perspective and from the curious perspective?
Well, I think the curious should stop worrying about a few things. You know, immigrants will eventually be grateful, but they can't instantly be grateful. So if you you know, come across somebody, and I was one, who isn't instantly behaving in ways that you expect them to behave, that's okay. Give them time. I remember people used to ask me, aren't you delighted to be here? Upon hearing that I came from Iran. It took me a long, long time to become delighted. But every time someone asked me that question, it just infuriated me. Give people time. Don't worry about, you know, if you're worried about whether or not they're learning language, you obviously don't understand that there is no match for the power of Spider-Man and Cinderella and Disney altogether. that every immigrant is going to have, eventually a next generation who will, who want to access, various ways of entertainment in this country, and entertainment always comes in one language, and that's English. And no matter how attached we are to our original languages, becoming part of or enjoying some of the things that exist here require that we learn the language. And so don't worry about that. It will come. It means nothing if people speak with an accent or haven't mastered the language yet. It will inevitably come. And I think it's also important to know that the reason we have done better than other Western nations in acculturating and making immigrants feel at home here is that we allow them to be hyphenated. We celebrate Greek Americans. We celebrate, we all eat tacos and quesadillas. We all understand that to be who we are, we need to allow for everybody to express their hyphens, and it doesn't threaten either side of the equation. We become more American and by hanging on to some of the best aspects of the cultures of our origins. So I think we just need to be aware of these elements a little more.
Thank you so much, Roya. Thank you everyone out there joining. And thank you so much to the Connecticut Humanities for their support. Thank you to Murtha Cullina and Dana Buchin for your support of this event as well. Thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today.